Eliminating poverty is the dream of the world. Feeding, clothing, and sheltering every human being on the planet. Creating equitable communities and an equitable international community. Poverty and hunger are both part of everyday life in regions of the world often called developing nations, previously called the Third World and now most commonly called the Global South. Not the geographic South, but instead the continents of Africa and South America, as well as regions like Central America and parts of Asia. In the Global North, we are fed a narrative that we, the rich nations, are developing the poor nations and that it is through our aid and our guidance that the Global South can reach that dream of eliminating much of their poverty. Unfortunately for all of us, this is a fiction. Today, approximately 4.3 billion people, which is more than 60% of the world's population, live in crippling poverty, struggling to survive on less than the equivalent of what $5 per day can buy in the United States. Poverty is not decreasing worldwide at the rate that institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations claim, and researchers and economists have begun to expose this narrative. The Global North is not developing the Global South. It is underdeveloping the Global South. Through manipulation of data, crushing debt traps, covert intelligence operations, military interventions, and a modification of age-old colonialism tactics, rich nations are keeping poor nations in their current state, and unless the entire economic system that maintains this inequality is replaced, this relationship, this exploitation, will always continue. Why are some nations rich and some nations poor? In the Global North, those of us living a relatively comfortable life frequently offer simplistic and uninformed opinions. Maybe they don't work hard enough, some might offer. But the working poor in impoverished nations generally work long hours with few of the benefits received in richer nations. Even in the Global North, those struggling to make ends meet will tell you that it is not for lack of trying, and that they will often have to work multiple jobs with little time for rest. The poor work more, not less. Maybe, others might suggest, their values are backwards and institutions too corrupt. But placing the blame on internal culture and internal matters only ignores globalization, international trade, and other ways in which nations interact and make internal matters only a piece of the puzzle. Such an argument also betrays an arrogance about our culture, values, and religions being right, and an ignorance about the corruption that also exists in rich nations. Maybe, some might even suggest, poor nations simply have always been poor and always will be poor, offering a kind of fatalism in lieu of evidence and research. Simplistic answers to extremely complex questions can be comforting, but in order to grapple with why the world is the way it is, both a longer view of history and the consequences of modern-day global capitalism must be understood. The history of the Global South is a history of underdevelopment by the Global North. According to The Divide by Jason Hickel, if we rewind to about 1500, a very different story emerges. At that time, there was little difference between Europe and the rest of the world when it came to the living standards of ordinary people. In fact, people living in South America, India, and Asia were in many ways better off than Europeans. Life expectancy in England was between 32 and 34 years, and a dismal 15 for children born into working-class families. Evidence from China, Japan, and other parts of Asia suggests that people in these regions also lived longer, healthier lives than Europeans did. Japan enjoyed a life expectancy of 41 to 45, China between 35 and 40, and parts of Southeast Asia around 42. Asia exceeded Europe in transportation technology, better sanitation, public health systems, and nutritional standards. Europe in the year 1500 was emerging from the Dark Ages and depopulation due to the Black Plague. Massive population loss stunted development of the continent by annihilating their labor force and weakening their institutions. Partly because of this, Europe in 1500 only accounted for approximately 15% of the global gross domestic product. China and India together controlled 65%. So, what happened in the following centuries to completely rearrange the global economy? Much in the way that Europe suffered from depopulation in the 14th and 15th centuries, Africa, North America, and South America were depopulated by European conquerors in the 16th century through the 19th century, through slavery, executions, warfare, and control, all in the service of stripping resources from other nations, many of which prior to that time were not suffering from poverty. This was the world system of colonialism. Colonialism is a policy of conquering, stealing, and controlling a new territory, often from afar, and snatching power from the indigenous people, making them either second-class citizens or removing citizenry outright in favor of enslavement. Regions that were colonized suffered centuries of depopulation and dispossession of their resources. For example, between Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492 and the early 1600s, Latin America's indigenous population shrunk by as much as 95%. If Europe's economy could be slowed for centuries from poor health standards and a loss of 30% of its population, imagine what losing nearly everyone could do to a region. By the early 1800s, a total of 100 million kilograms of silver had been stolen from Latin America and inserted into the European economy, first into Spain and then into the rest of Europe as payment on Spain's debts. Because Spain was indebted to other nations due to its expensive involvement in the Crusades, the riches of the New World flooded to Spain's creditors, eventually enriching much of Europe. In Africa, the continent was depopulated partly through warfare but also through the rampant slave trade. European historians claim that at least 10 million African slaves landed alive in the Americas, Atlantic Islands, and Europe, but this is considered a low estimate and does not take into consideration the full impact of the slave trade. For example, the figure does not account for those who died in transit, or smuggled slaves, or those killed during the banditry of capturing slaves. Furthermore, this figure does not count the East African slave trade or the Arab slave trade. To maintain the extraction of wealth from the colonies, the rich nations kept the poor nations in a state of dependency. The rich nations assigned poor nations or regions a particular resource for extraction, such as tea or sugar. This created a kind of monoculture for each poor nation or region, now trapped in a locked economy and without the infrastructure for expansion. Colonization in Africa lasted longer than in many other regions, as approximately 90% of the continent was under European control even in the early 20th century. Prior to colonialism, Africa was advancing and progressing economically and politically. Had the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism never been imposed on Africa, its development almost certainly would not have stagnated. The global economy post-colonialism is still affected by colonialism, though. For example, the terms of trade were ruined, perhaps forever, for Africa, South America, and other regions. Their exports decreased relative to the prices of goods they imported, spending more to receive less. For another, worker wages remained low. Post-colonialism, the global North could still impose an unequal exchange on regions that they had only recently colonized and enslaved. Again from Jason Hickel. The fact that slavery was used up through the 19th century further contributed to downward pressure on wages, as workers had to compete with free labor. And why do poor countries have a comparative deficit of capital in the first place? Partly because they were plundered of precious metals, and partly because their colonizers forcibly destroyed local industries so that they would have no choice but to consume Western exports. Orthodox economic theory presupposes international inequalities as if they have always existed, but the historical record is clear that they were purposefully created. Inexpensive or free labor throughout the history of colonialism provided the capital for the Industrial Revolution in Europe. This allowed richer nations to develop and modernize in the 19th century, and prevented poor nations from doing the same for a long time. Defenders of the economic inequality that greatly favors the global North use rhetoric like, "that was then, this is now," to ignore the long-lasting consequences of colonialism, as well as how colonialism set up the current terms of unequal trade. And once again, these factors are introduced from external forces, not internal policy. Poor nations produce raw materials which are then exported to rich nations, which are then sold back to the poor nations. Historian Clifford Cobb explained it like this. One of the legacies of colonialism is that the poor countries of the Third World are continuing to export raw materials, and the countries of Europe and North America produce and export finished products. This stems from a process that was developed long ago, and the intention was to make sure that the countries of the Third World remained backward and remained dependent and are never able to develop. So to this day, they are continuing to survive on the export of raw materials. That has always been to the disadvantage of the countries exporting the raw materials, and it gets worse each year. In other words, independence did not produce complete liberation. Poor nations have their own political structure and laws, but they operate under an economic system that continues to make them dependent on rich nations. The goal of rich nations is to ensure that poor nations can never become rich enough to be competitors, must be stable enough to produce raw materials, but poor enough to keep those materials inexpensive. Much of this unequal relationship between the global North and global South is maintained through debt. Following the end of colonialism, the massive debts of the rich colonial powers were transferred to the newly formed independent nations. This was in violation of international law, but the new nations did not have the resources to contest this. The global North's solution was to make the global South even more subservient through new debts with high interest payments. With no other options, poor nations took out these loans and accrued further debt. In general, it works like this. A rich nation sees a resource in a poor nation that it requires, such as oil or raw materials for commodities. The rich nation then arranges a loan to that poor nation with the World Bank. The World Bank provides these loans under conditions such as forced privatization and agreements that will benefit the global North. Then, in order to pay off this enormous debt, the poor nation makes an agreement with the rich nation to sell that resource for very little. It's a kind of debt trap. These debts give rich nations the power to impose policy on poor nations. A layman observer might object to this, claiming that rich nations provide foreign aid to poor nations, but the devil is in the details. Aid given to poor nations is vastly outnumbered by what is taken from poor nations. According to Global Financial Integrity and the Center for Applied Research at the Norwegian School of Economics, the Global South receives approximately $2 trillion in all aid, investment, and income from abroad, but it loses approximately $5 trillion taken predominantly from the Global North. Foreign aid is also conditional, not a gift, and the conditions are the continued unequal relationship with rich nations. David Sogi, author of Give and Take, What's the Matter with Foreign Aid, explained it like this. The usual insinuation is of unproductive and ungrateful welfare queens living high on northern generosity. That is an illusion. Foreign aid is a sideshow. Northern financial circuits gain from southern capital, whether looted or legitimately saved. So, what happens when a poor nation is fed up, tries to help its own people, or the people revolt against the current order? Rich nations step in and put a stop to it. The system of global capitalism is not simply the natural outcome of markets. It is the maintenance of the unequal relationship between the global North and global South, often by force. When a head of state or head of government is elected or assumes power in the global South, that ruler faces a secondary challenge outside of the governance of the people. They must also capitulate to the global North, endorse capitalism, and maintain the current unequal economic relationship and trade deals. If they do not, there is a good chance that this ruler or regime will be overthrown, either directly by or with some assistance from rich nations, most prominently the United States. There is a long history of this. Following the completion of westward expansion in the 19th century, the U.S. faced a turning point and a new question. Should they be satisfied with the current level of wealth and territory, or expand its influence across the world? The United States' desire for expansion, influence, and control of other nations is an economic concern, not a desire to spread democracy. It almost always came down to money. Stephen Kinzer, author of Overthrow, explained it like this. By the end of the 19th century, farms and factories in the United States were producing considerably more goods than Americans could consume. For the nation to continue its rise to wealth, it needed foreign markets. They could not be found in Europe, where governments protected domestic industries behind high tariff walls. Americans had to look to faraway countries, weak countries, countries that had large markets and rich resources but had not yet fallen under the sway of any great power. Here are only a few examples of US-backed coups and interventions as well as the economic concerns surrounding them. In 1949, the United States assisted in regime change in Syria. President Shukri al-Quwatli refused to allow the US-sponsored oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia through Syria and into Lebanon. The CIA had an asset on the inside, and with their help, Syria installed Husni al-Zaim, who approved the oil pipeline, and began rounding up left-wing opposition. In 1953, the United States assisted in regime change in Iran. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, stripping away operations from British oil corporations. Declassified CIA documents prove that the United States had a hand in Mossadegh's removal. Mossadegh spent the rest of his life under house arrest. In 1954, the United States assisted in regime change in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz threatened holdings of U.S.-owned United Fruit Company. The CIA equipped paramilitary troops, and the U.S. Navy blockaded the coast. The president was removed from power, leaving the nation run by a succession of military juntas. In 1960, the United States and Belgium ousted Congo's Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. Belgium wanted to maintain its business interests in the region after decolonization. Lumumba was killed in 1961. In 1964, the United States helped oust Brazilian President João Goulart, whose left-wing politics threatened capitalism. In 1973, the United States backed a military coup against democratically elected President Salvador Allende, who was a socialist, in favor of the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, a fascist capitalist who was responsible for countless atrocities. There are a great many more, including Vietnam, Indonesia, Ecuador, Laos, Iraq, all of which were carried out for the same reason as the debt traps and exploitation of raw materials, to maintain the relationship between rich nations and poor nations. If a poor nation wants to abandon capitalism, or if a poor nation threatens rich nations with competition, that is when the CIA resorts to covert regime change. If poor nations want to exist, they are forced to accept the terms of rich nations. If poor nations want to do more than simply exist, but actually flourish, they are violently crushed, and a more compliant head of state is installed by rich nations. In other words, there is no way out of poverty for poor nations, so long as rich nations purposefully keep them indebted and subservient. To propagate the myth that wealthy capitalist nations are greatly reducing poverty and that we should allow them to continue doing whatever they want, the World Bank occasionally releases data that shows global poverty gradually decreasing. It is the lie that we have been told for years, but recently, independent economists and researchers have begun to publicize critiques of this data and have largely proven that global poverty is either stagnant or increasing, depending on whether one is calculating using percentages or total numbers. The most well-read critique might be Jason Hickel's calculation in The Divide. Here is the more accurate data from this book. In terms of absolute numbers, the original metric by which the world's governments agreed to measure progress, the numbers show that the poverty headcount is exactly the same now as it was when measurements began back in 1981, at approximately 1 billion people. Of course, this is only according to the lowest possible poverty lines established by organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations. The International Poverty Line, instituted by the World Bank, is a measurement of $1.90 per day. $1.90 is the international equivalent of what that amount can buy in the United States. Researchers are now saying that people need at least $5 per day just in order to have a good chance of surviving until their 5th birthday, having enough food to eat, and reaching normal life expectancy. If we moved the poverty line to this more accurate level, we would see a total poverty headcount of over 4 billion people. That is most of humanity. Poverty has become worse over time, with more than 1 billion people added to the ranks of the poor since 1981. So, how did the World Bank and the United Nations get away with misleading figures that show the opposite? The World Bank wants to present the case that privatization and capitalism in general are making the world better, and that their efforts specifically are causing a net positive for the world, particularly the global south. It's in their best interests to show the rosiest possible narrative. Their institutional power and authority afford them a kind of leeway among the press and among the people. So much, in fact, that they can perform statistical manipulation that is uncritically swallowed. Why is the IPL so low despite reams of evidence and a call to adjust it to much higher? Because if the World Bank made the IPL accurate, it would reveal that their debts, conditions of privatization, and such were unhelpful. Their calculations are not in error, they are just using the wrong numbers to begin with. Over the past couple decades, every time bad news about poverty would come out of statistics from the World Bank, they would change the IPL or other measurements shortly thereafter and claim that the bad news from just a few days ago is now retroactively false based on their new numbers. It's the global equivalent of putting a thumb on the scales. But that's not all. The United Nations also presents this rosy narrative to give the impression that the global economy is on the right track. It may be for the global north, but not so much for the global south. They began this data analysis in 2000 with their Millennium Development Goals. They do this manipulation in several ways. First, they changed the measurement of poverty from absolute numbers to proportional numbers, allowing for the appearance of less suffering over time due to population growth. The moral calculus of this is appalling because it implies that even if there is more and more suffering throughout the world, so long as the population of less impoverished people keeps growing, the increasing number of poor people can be seen as decreasing. Second, to manipulate the data further, the UN moved the starting point from 2000, when they actually began doing things, to 1990 to take advantage of gains made prior to when they even started the program. They did this to take credit for massive improvement on poverty in China during the 90s, and to add those figures to their data. The reason this is so disingenuous is that the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund cannot claim to be responsible for improvement in poverty in China. China, and a few other nations in that region, are some of the only places in the world where free market capitalism was not forcibly imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. China was not subject to the structural adjustment imposed on the global south. In other words, our current economic system has not made the global south better. It has made it worse. And the only nations mostly immune to the machinations of the World Bank and IMF are communist nations in Asia. The data presented by the World Bank and the United Nations has consistently been proven false in recent years, but an uncritical media that loves the rosy narrative will still sometimes reprint this misleading data without calling it into question. This might seem obvious, but it apparently needs to be said. The watchdog for the World Bank cannot be the World Bank. Global capitalism is a complex system, and we are not all economists. Perhaps this can all be better understood if the machinations of global capitalism can be compared to the more accessible daily life of an individual. A layman observer might wonder why the global south participates in this obvious debt trap, but the answer is the same for why an individual labors under the thumb of a corporation, because that individual has no choice. The relationship between rich nations and poor nations is not dissimilar from the relationship between a rich individual and a poor individual within a nation. That individual, like everyone under capitalism, is being exploited for their labor. That individual will always produce far more for the corporation than they will ever receive from the corporation. But there are bills to pay, a family to feed, and that individual is forced to participate in their own exploitation until the system is abolished and replaced completely. A layman observer might also wonder how rich nations that fund rebellions and stage coups in poor nations could get away with this violation of international law so consistently if it is so terrible. The answer is the same for why an individual can be subjected to state violence within their own nation, even when it is blatantly illegal and immoral, because this violence is protected and enshrined in a culture as being for some greater good. It is not exactly one-to-one, but hopefully that will make things clearer. What is happening internally within a nation is also happening in a grander scale externally, and it has been happening for a very long time. Hi everyone. If you want to learn more, the sources are in the description, as usual. Most of the sources were cited in the video. The Divide by Jason Hickel, Give and Take by David Sogi, Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, as well as documentaries like The End of Poverty and Poverty, Inc.